Chapter 24. Captivated by her delightful partner, Ayianna continued to whirl around the room in an enchanted waltz. The gentleman's presence kept her questions at bay, her fever in check, and she decided she must be in a dream, a strange but wonderful dream. His hands pressed against her back, and she leaned into his compelling embrace. "My lady," he whispered softly in her ear, "you are so graceful, so beautiful and pure, so innocent." He kissed Ayianna's temple. Her pulse raced. For a moment, she felt his passion become hers. He wanted her, and she was willing. She would promise him anything. Ayianna glanced up, but her insides went rigid as revulsion ruptured her dreamlike trance. His sallow face contorted, his lips parted into a hideous smile, revealing two slender eye teeth. A forked tongue flickered between his teeth as his eyes devoured her. Ayianna tried to pull away, but his embrace imprisoned her. He wrenched her against him and nuzzled her neck. She screamed as the sharp fangs pierced her skin. A burst of icy venom poured into her body, and her vision darkened. Cale's blood ran cold as Ayianna's scream echoed throughout the castle. The eerie music had ceased. Sounds of scraping drew near. Certain the scream had come from ahead, Cale rushed toward the large double doors and slammed through them. A man lifted his head. No, not a man, a beast. Blood dripped from his gaping mouth. In his arms, Ayianna hung lifelessly. "Knock!" Cale yelled. He charged, sword in hand. "Let her go!" Knock flung Ayianna aside and leapt into the air. Large, leathery wings burst from his back, ripping his clothes. He belched a ball of flame, and Cale dove out of the way. The winged lord circled the room and shrieked. Cale ran to Ayianna, but Knock lunged and slashed at him. Sharp nails raked across Cale's shoulder. He spun and drove his sword deep into the monster's belly. Knock collapsed, but a laugh gurgled in his throat. "You cannot kill me." His forked tongue licked blood from his lips, and he glared at Cale. "It is useless. She is dying." He slumped over, crushing his leathery wings beneath him. His eyes closed, but his lips cracked in a sardonic smile. Desmond burst into the hall, followed by the scratching of 100 scurrying feet echoing through the halls. In the distance came the sound of flapping wings and high-pitched screams. A chill ran down his back. "Where have you been all this time?" Cale gritted his teeth and rushed to Ayianna's side. "I got—" Desmond faltered. Cale lifted Ayianna. Her body sagged in his arms, and her head flopped against his chest. The weight of his failure escalated. "What happened? Is she all right?" Desmond strode over to where Knock lay and prodded the lord with his foot. "What in all of Nalu is this?" Cale hoisted Ayianna over his shoulder. "Where's Vian?" "Run!" Vian burst into the hall. "Harpies!" Cale and the others rushed outside and into an angry mob of trolls. He darted left and passed by large, cage-like buildings made of stone. Shimmering eyes glared at him from behind the iron bars, but he didn't stop to investigate. The ground shuddered as the trolls gave pursuit. Desmond and Vian flanked Cale as they outran the trolls, who were now peering in and out of stone buildings looking for them. Dogs snarled and howled behind them. Cale ducked between boulders, but a large hound leapt in front of him. Tremors shook its hairless, wrinkly skin, and slobber dribbled from its long incisors. White eyes bore into Cale as if they alone could destroy him. Cale stumbled, but caught himself before he fell. He repositioned Ayianna and fumbled with his sword. Footsteps pounded behind him as the hound advanced. He couldn't get a proper grip on the hilt. The hound lunged, but Desmond's blade plunged forward and slashed its throat. Cale shifted Ayianna and dashed to the right. Ahead, the eerie light rose from the abyss. "They're here!" Vian gasped, his eyes wide with horror. "Oh, we are all going to die!" A large bat-like creature dropped from the sky. It bore the slender face of a woman too narrow to be human. Dirty, scraggly hair topped her head like a rooster's comb. Her shriveled skin stretched across sharp bones, and her eyes burned with an insatiable hunger. She dove for Cale, no doubt to retrieve her master's dinner. Cale leapt out of the way as the harpy sped past. She soared into the air and corkscrewed back to the earth. Her lizard-like tail swung dangerously close to his head. He ducked, but one of the poisonous barbs scratched the back of his neck, blasting fire through his skin. Vian jumped to Kale's side, his blade hissing through the air, and struck one of the harpy's wings. Shrieking, she tumbled to the ground. She flipped the knotted hair from her face and scrambled after Kale. He lifted his sword arm to fend her off, but it wavered. Or was it him? Was the harpy's poison so quick? He staggered back as his vision shifted and nausea burned his throat. The harpy's thin lips twisted into a sneer. Her knobby arm shot forward and Kale jerked Ayianna out of the way. Her claws bit into Kale's thigh instead. He stumbled away as Vian decapitated the harpy. Dazed, Kale shook his head, but the world kept spinning. Ayanna's weight doubled. He'd drop her if he wasn't careful. Desmond grasped his shoulder, whispering, but the words didn't make any sense. The merchant's frown twisted in anger. He grabbed Ayanna's arm and pulled. Of course, Kale shifted her limp body to Desmond's shoulder, but the lack of her weight unbalanced him and he fell to his knees. His vertigo slowly lessened and a headache blossomed in the back of his skull. He rubbed his neck. The harpy's barb had only brushed the surface of the skin, and hopefully its poisonous effect would be short-lived. For that he was thankful, if not a little nauseous. "Look out!" Vian exclaimed. Shrieks filled the night sky as more harpies descended upon them. Would this be the end? Kale clenched his jaw against the dizziness and headache. He would not go down without a fight. He stood, grabbed his bow, and hurled arrows into the mass of wings and claws. His unsteady aim still managed to hit some of the harpies. More hounds burst from the shadows. He knocked his last arrow, but it sailed above their heads. Vian charged and swung into the pack, cutting one down. Deja vu slammed into Kale, and it was Terran, rushing, sword raised, defending his family from the imps. Kale shook his head, and his vision cleared. He wrenched his sword free of its scabbard and slashed at the others. Vian yelped. A brown splotchy hound had the prince by the leg and was dragging him away. Kale lunged to Vian's side and ran the hound through. He helped the prince to his feet and scanned the area for Desmond and Ayianna. Desmond stood several yards to the left in the middle of a harpy's assault. Ayianna lay crumpled on the ground. Anger surged through him. How could the fool have discarded her like that? He rushed to her side. The harpy dove and swiped. Kale ducked, but her claws caught Desmond across the ear. He swore and jabbed the sword into her side. She flopped to the ground and wobbled away. Kale bent to pick up Ayianna. "Kale!" Vian hollered. The last hound barreled toward Kale, snarling. He grabbed his sword and swung, catching the hound's front leg. The hound yelped and tumbled forward. It scrambled for traction, but its momentum carried it over the edge of the cliff. Kale knelt to catch his breath. Below, howling winds tore at the creviced canyon, stretching forever into the depths of the earth. He inched away from the mighty vacuum of the canyon and glanced over at Ayianna, but Desmond held her. At least she was safe for the moment. Vian stood next to them, favoring his right leg. He brandished his blade in front of him. Kale tightened his grip on his sword and turned to face the creatures he was certain he'd find. A dozen harpies surrounded them, perched on boulders and other stone formations jutting from the rocky soil. Their red eyes glared as if daring them to flee. Why didn't they attack? A sallow face loomed above them as his thin lips curved into a sneer. Knock. He stood next to a particularly large harpy and ran his slender fingers through her wild hair. "Did you think you could escape?" "How are you alive?" Desmond shifted Ayianna in his arms. Where was his sword? "I am immortal," Nock laughed as he stretched his leather wings. "But you are not." The winged lord rushed toward Desmond. Brilliant flames exploded from the ground in front of Desmond. The force knocked Nock backward and dispersed the harpies. The winged lord shrieked and clawed at his eyes as prisms of light soared into the darkness. The fiery streams swelled and converged into two giant men. But just as quickly they dissolved into the flames and formed a dome of flickering white. Ruoks? Kale whirled around, searching the shadows. Who had summoned them? "To the caves!" a rough voice commanded. A tall, bald man materialized out of the shadows and strode into the dome. Around his neck hung a stone, pulsating with light. He quickly drew his cloak about him and concealed the pendant. A leather patch covered his left eye, but the remaining one reprimanded them. Nevin Darren. Cale sheathed his sword. How did you? No time! Go! Cale raced toward the great cliffs towering in the night. The blinding light arced high into the sky and dissolved as they charged into the caves. Spasms of light stung his vision until his eyes adjusted to the darkness around him. Vian and Desmond stood next to him. Desmond still cradled Ayianna in his arms. A rush of wind and heavy footsteps echoed off the walls as the tall form of Darren strode into the cave and stopped. Cale held his breath. What happened? Why did you stray from the trail? Cale lowered his head. I am without an excuse. Darren, I presume. Desmond shifted Ayianna to his other shoulder and exposed his right ear. 3 slashes cut across it and dribbled blood on his neck and tunic. We have no time for pleasantries, Darren snapped. Then his gaze fell on Ayianna. What is wrong with the girl? Knock, Cale said. Darren turned Ayanna's head and examined her neck. Blood trickled from 2 small wounds, her skin ashen and her lips blue. The venom is fast. I will take her, and you 3 will have to keep up. Darren lifted Ayianna from Desmond's arms and rushed ahead through the dark cave. Cale ran to keep up as guilt and anger surged through him. He had known better, but instead he had listened to lies. He had been weak, and he despised weakness.